I mean, I think he should. I honestly hope that Sony just let him walk, because that would be good for everyone.
Everyone knew George Michael as the golden voice behind Careless Whisper, Faith, and Father Figure. To the world, he was untouchable, a pop icon who could do no wrong. But in 1992, at the height of his fame, George did something unthinkable. He walked away from his record label and straight into a courtroom. What followed wasn't just a legal battle, it was a personal war against an industry giant. One man versus Sony Music. They called him arrogant, they called him foolish. Some even said he'd destroyed his own career. But George didn't flinch. He said he was fighting for something bigger, for every artist who'd ever signed a contract they didn't understand, and paid the price. But what really happened behind the scenes? Why did George Michael declare war on the very machine that made him a superstar? And what was the heartbreaking reason he risked losing everything? Because buried deep in the court filings, buried under the headlines, was a secret, a silent rebellion, and a decision that would cost him everything. Until years later, the industry finally admitted he was right. So why did it take so long? And what did it really cost him? You're about to find out. If you love the untold stories of music's biggest icons, the secrets, the battles, and the betrayals, subscribe to RetroWaves now. We uncover what others leave behind. In 1990, George Michael had the world at his feet. After conquering the pop charts with Wham!, George's solo career had reached stratospheric heights. His debut solo album, Faith, became a cultural event, selling over 25 million copies, topping charts globally, and making George the first white solo artist to top the US R&B charts. He was adored by critics and fans alike, earning a Grammy and a seat at music's elite table. But behind the glitter, things weren't what they seemed. The pressure to repeat the formula was intense. George had built an image, a leather-clad sex symbol with MTV perfect swagger. But by the end of the Faith era, he was exhausted. He felt commodified, reduced, as if the music was no longer about expression, but performance. He started seeing a difference between George Michael the brand and George Michael the man. So when it came time for his next album, Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1, George made a drastic creative choice. No music videos, no promotional tours, no face on the cover, just the songs and the message.
Maybe we should all be praying for time.
It was his quiet rebellion, and Sony, his label, wasn't pleased. They'd expected Faith 2.0. Instead, they got a reflective, somber, political album with jazz and orchestral influences. It was a masterstroke of songwriting, but lacked the commercial glitter Sony banked on. The singles didn't reach #1. The album didn't generate the same explosive visuals, and George, refusing to promote it, vanished from the limelight. When Listen Without Prejudice didn't reach Faith-level sales, George felt betrayed. He believed Sony had intentionally underpromoted the record to punish him for asserting creative control. Sony denied this, but the damage was done. The tension boiled beneath the surface, until one day, George made a decision few artists had ever dared. He would sue his label. But was it about money, music, or something far more personal? George Michael had signed his first record deal in 1982 at just 19 years old, with Intervision, a small label. That contract was eventually transferred to CBS Records, and then to Sony Music when they acquired CBS in 1988. The deal? George was obligated to deliver 8 full-length albums. In return, he received advances and promotional backing. But the contract didn't reflect what George had become, a global superstar, not a young hopeful. He had no control over how the label promoted his albums, what singles were chosen, or how much budget was allocated to his projects. And, perhaps most importantly, he had no way out. Even if the relationship with Sony soured, he was stuck. At the start, George didn't ask too many questions. Few young artists did. The excitement of getting signed, of recording music, of seeing your face on a billboard, it was enough. But by 1990, things had changed. He had sold millions, toured the world, written and produced his own work. Yet he still couldn't renegotiate the terms or move to a label that better supported his vision. And then came Listen Without Prejudice. George poured his soul into it. It was personal, reflective, and bold. But when Sony didn't push it the way they had pushed Faith, he felt betrayed. He started asking questions. Why wasn't this album given the same radio support? Why weren't the ballads pushed in key markets? Why were international promotional budgets slashed? Sony insisted they had done their part. But George saw something else, a silent punishment for daring to say no, for daring to be more than just a product. He realized something chilling. The contract he signed as a teenager now held his career hostage. So he made a choice no one expected. He took Sony to court, and what unfolded next shook the industry. While the world speculated about legal motives and creative clashes, few understood the true weight pressing on George Michael at the time. In 1991, George suffered a devastating loss. His partner, Anselmo Filippa, died suddenly of an AIDS-related brain hemorrhage. Their relationship had been private, hidden from the public, the press, and even some friends. George hadn't come out publicly, and the stigma surrounding AIDS in the early 90s was still ferocious. The grief was overwhelming. But George had to carry it in silence. He couldn't publicly mourn the man he loved, couldn't share the heartbreak, couldn't even mention Anselmo's name in interviews without fear of tabloid frenzy or fan backlash. "I was in a relationship with someone who was everything to me," George later said, "and I lost him. And I couldn't even tell people what he meant." While mourning privately, George was also facing pressure from Sony. They wanted a follow-up. They wanted another hit. They wanted George Michael, the pop icon, not George, the grieving man. This contradiction tore him apart. He wanted time to heal. They wanted product. And so the lawsuit wasn't just about control. It wasn't even just about art. It was about something far deeper, the right to be human. George needed to escape the machine, not just for his career, but for his sanity. In every court document, in every statement, there was an unspoken truth. He was grieving, and no one, not even the people profiting from his voice, gave him the space to feel it. That's why he had to fight, even if it cost him everything. In October 1992, George Michael filed a lawsuit against Sony Music, formally accusing them of restraint of trade. His lawyers claimed the contract was unfair, outdated, and exploitive, forcing an artist to remain with a company that no longer supported his vision while offering no exit path. In court, George was calm but resolute. He wasn't suing for money, he wasn't asking for damages, all he wanted was freedom. Sony, however, came with their full legal arsenal. They denied the allegations and countered by highlighting the millions they had already invested in George's career. "This is not slavery," Sony's legal team argued. "This is business." The courtroom became a war zone of clashing philosophies. George's side: an artist has a right to control his career and walk away from a toxic deal. Sony's side: a contract is a contract, even if it was signed when the artist was 19. The press was divided. Some outlets championed George as a freedom fighter for musicians. Others called him ungrateful, a pampered millionaire trying to escape a legal agreement just because his album didn't sell as well. But George remained defiant. He told the press, "I don't want to make records for people who view me as an asset, not an artist." For him, this wasn't just a legal case, it was personal. He was fighting for every musician who had ever been boxed in, worn out, or silenced. But in 1994, after almost 2 years of hearings, the verdict arrived. And it wasn't what he hoped. The British High Court ruled against George Michael. The judge concluded that Sony's contract was not manifestly unfair, and aligned with industry norms. George had willingly signed the deal, they said, and regardless of his fame now, he had to honor it. It was a crushing blow. 2 years of fighting, millions in legal fees, endless headlines, and nothing to show for it. George's fans were divided. Some felt he should move on. Others believed he had exposed a dangerous truth about industry power. George himself was quiet in the days after the ruling. Devastated, yes, but not defeated. Behind closed doors, something shifted. Sony executives, perhaps sensing the long-term reputational cost of holding him hostage, began negotiating. And in 1995, a deal was struck. Virgin Records and DreamWorks co-signed George for future albums, reportedly buying out the remainder of his Sony contract. He was finally free. But the cost was steep. He had lost momentum in the most critical years of his career. From 1990 to 1996, an era of hip-hop emergence, Britpop explosion, and digital transformation, George Michael had been mostly silent. No chart-topping hits, no world tours, no reinvention. The pop world had moved on, but George had his piece. He had earned it the hard way. Though George lost in court, his actions sent a ripple through the industry. Suddenly, artists began speaking out. Prince, who was already in a contract war with Warner Brothers, doubled down. He appeared in public with "Slave" written on his face, echoing George's fight for artistic ownership. Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails later voiced similar frustrations with his label. Even younger acts like Radiohead and Björk began negotiating smarter contracts with clauses protecting their creative control. George had cracked something open. Even Sony quietly adjusted their future artist deals. Shorter commitments, more flexible licensing, options for profit sharing. It wasn't a revolution, but it was the start of one. Industry insiders began whispering that George, despite losing, had embarrassed Sony, that his bravery had scared label executives into making real changes. George lost the legal battle, one anonymous A&R rep admitted, but he won the moral one. Years later, even Sony's leadership would reflect on the ordeal with a hint of regret. George had held up a mirror, and they hadn't liked what they saw. In 1996, George returned with Older, his most intimate and personal work yet. It wasn't just an album, it was a healing process.
Don't you think I'm looking older?
Songs like Jesus to a Child,
Like Jesus to a child.
and You Have Been Loved were open letters to Anselmo.
That man, she loved that man.
For the first time, George was writing without masks, without manipulation, without fear. Critics hailed the album as mature, poetic, and hauntingly beautiful. Commercially, it did well, but not faith-level explosive. And George didn't mind. He was finally at peace with not being a pop machine. "I make music when I'm inspired," he said, "not because someone tells me to." And for the first time in years, he smiled again, not as a brand, but as a man. The lawsuit had taken years from him, but it had also given something back: control, authenticity, truth, and no court ruling could ever take that away. Years later, in one of his last in-depth interviews, George Michael looked back at the Sony lawsuit not with anger, but with clarity. "It was hell. It nearly broke me, but it needed to happen." He spoke of the loneliness during those years, of watching peers soar while he remained locked in limbo, of feeling like a ghost in an industry he had once dominated, but also of healing, coming out to friends, writing songs about real grief, reconnecting with his purpose. He admitted the lawsuit changed how he saw everything: fame, art, love, and loyalty. He no longer trusted the machine. He no longer needed to, because he had already faced its worst and survived. "They wanted my music, my face, my name, but they didn't want me." And that realization led to something beautiful. George started mentoring younger artists, encouraging them to own their masters, to be careful with their contracts, to know their worth before chasing fame. He became, quietly, a guide. And when he passed in 2016, artists around the world paid tribute, not just to his songs, but to his strength. Because what George Michael did in that courtroom may not have earned him a trophy, but it carved a path. George Michael's battle with Sony didn't result in new laws or courtroom triumphs, but it sparked a cultural shift. It reminded the world that artists are not just products. They are people, with grief, with passion, with agency. Today, artists fight for their rights more openly. Conversations around contracts, masters, and creative control are mainstream, and George's voice, calm, thoughtful, fierce, still echoes in those debates. He paid the price for challenging the system, but he bought something priceless for those who came after: freedom. So, when we look back at George Michael's career, we remember the hits, yes, but we should also remember the silence, the years he spent waiting for justice, and the quiet dignity with which he fought. Because maybe that's the mark of a true legend, not how many records they sell, but how many doors they open. George Michael didn't just make music, he made a stand. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to RetroWaves for more music legends who risked everything to speak their truth. And tell us in the comments, do you think George really lost? Because sometimes losing the battle is how you win the war.